Thank you very much, Caroline. Thank you very much, David, for putting me on the spot.
We don't hear you, Olivia.
Ah, that's a good start, isn't it? Whoops.
Now we do.
I have 3 microphones around me, so I'm hoping that... Is that better?
Yes. Yeah.
Good. So, when David asked me whether I wanted to give the next keynote for the 3rd conference of Mistra Urban Futures, I had several panic attacks. The first one was that my mind immediately went to the magnificent talk that Caroline, who just introduced me, gave last year, and which I will not be able to in any way match. So in any case, the second panic attack was that what I would go on to talk about, the future of universities, is a journey and is a project that is ongoing. So can you imagine giving a keynote on something that is far from wrapped up or clearly thought through? So with those 2 premises, I do want to thank David, because of course nothing like a keynote forces you to sharpen a little bit the mind. So I am delighted to be here, because I am delighted to be on Mistra Urban Futures board, and I am just a little bit unhappy that I will see very little of Cape Town, so I'll have to come back. Without further ado, let me introduce then the topic. I ask whether we can reimagine ourselves. There are a lot of premises to this talk, and I'll give you a couple, but the subtitle is perhaps the most important. It's that this research and journey that we are engaging with as Intrepid, the network that I run in Europe on inter and transdisciplinarity, is a journey that has brought a lot of questions. And one of them has been to see how universities are, to use a terrible expression, increasingly apparently not fit for purpose, given the problems we have in this century. So we may disagree on this premise, of course, but it's important for you to know that this is the premise for what I will go on to talk about. And to introduce that idea, the idea that we as universities might be part of a problem rather than a solution, I'll share with you what I would like to call 3 postcards. Postcards from ideally different thought provokers. The first one happens to be a South African scholar. Let me share with you a quote from an article he published in 2016. Inequalities will keep growing worldwide, but far from fueling a renewed cycle of class struggle, social conflicts will increasingly take the form of racism, ultranationalism, sexism, ethnic and religious rivalries, xenophobia, homophobia, and other deadly passions. With this postcard, I'd like to summarize all the social crises you can imagine we're living today. And this is an image of our wonderful Mediterranean and what we daily read in the news. Second postcard, imagine, comes from Monbiot, who writes about our increasing incapacity to relate to nature to which we belong. And in very summary terms, I'd like to refer to you to that whole agenda that we now call the age of the Anthropocene, and the fact that we as humans, and in particular our technological prowess, have allowed us to become a force of nature ourselves. The third postcard comes from Gary Jacobs, who is, amongst many things, an economist, but has written a wonderful science fiction piece on artificial intelligence. And this is a quote from that book. The present evolutionary crisis we are facing arises from a disparity between our limited faculties, mental, ethical, and spiritual, and the technical and economical means at our disposal. Without an inner change, we can no longer cope with the gigantic developments of the outer life. And with this postcard, I'm summarizing a massive amount of literature and thought about the tension between whether we solve the problems that I've just summarized with the previous two postcards by looking outside and finding solutions out there, or by looking inside and finding better ways of being better humans. Now, many people have thought about all the problems that I will raise and hopefully all the solutions that I will propose. But there is one thinker on whose shoulders I have stood for almost my entire career, who is called Ernst Schumacher, who wrote many things, but the most famous is Small is Beautiful, which has a great subtitle as well, which is As If People Mattered. Now, Schumacher has answered many of the problems that we have today in very clear, succinct ways. Let me read his answer to my question, are we part of the problem? If Western civilization is in a state of permanent crisis, it is not far-fetched to suggest that there may be something wrong with its education. Mankind is in mortal danger, not because we are short of scientific or technological know-how, but because we tend to use it destructively and without wisdom. He wrote this in 1974. Now, some scholars argue that the entire edifice of education is part of the problem to the extent that it is linked to unlimited growth. So to the agenda, the idea, the ideology of economic growth. Some argue that the entire edifice of higher education is built for that purpose, to produce people that are able to contribute to that project. So here's a foresight, a future scientist called Slaughter, saying, despite the deteriorating global outlook, universities largely remain caught up in the earlier instrumental growth paradigm that brought us to this extremity in the first place. So let's say that we've answered, at least that there are serious reasons to think that universities today are more part of the problem than they are the solution. And my aim is very much to make them part of the solution and to make them active and purposeful agents for change, for a better world. Intrepid is a network that, as I mentioned, we run, and we started off, I guess, thinking that the problem, that is indeed how it started off, 4 or 5 years ago. We thought that the problem was in science policy and funding, and the fact that it just didn't fund enough inter- and transdisciplinary work. And as we worked our way through this thought, we found a lot of evidence that yes, that is a problem, but we found a lot of evidence that said that the reason why science policy and funding are doing less than a perfect job at funding inter- and transdisciplinarity lies, lo and behold, with scholars. Because it is us who inform the science, the policy, and the funding programs, and sit on those peer review committees and evaluations, and it is our mindset that is at the basis of that problem too. So that's why I'm here today talking and thinking with you a little bit more about the future of universities. It doesn't have funding for research, but we have funding for conferences, workshops, and training, and that's what we've been doing. And the first thing we did a year and a half ago was, oh dear, we've got some budget to spend before the end of the financial year, let's rush into that topic. And we ran the first workshop in London on what might possibly be the agenda for a future university journey of discovery. And I think Bertie was dragged into it from Mistra Urban Futures. I don't know if he's here, but anyway, he was a participant. We came up with, looking at it now, a year and a half later, and having read a lot about the topic, I'm impressed with the issues that we, a bunch of 15 scholars and I think a couple of professional researchers could think through in one day. we've ticked a lot of the boxes. But meanwhile, what we did say is, okay, let's go and see what is the map of the debate. And part of what I will say today here is the result of that effort in looking at different sources. We basically looked at what is being said in higher education literature, in sustainability, higher education and knowledge combinations, around the topic of Anthropocene, higher education and knowledge, and about futures and higher education. So there are different bodies of literature talking about disciplinary boundaries, which sometimes talk to each other, often do not. But we tried to put them together. And of course, we looked at the United Nations policy on education and sustainable development and the SDGs, which I hope to get to in time. These are, you don't need to read this, but this is basically the list of the actions we decided we would fund with Intrepid since that workshop. And we're sort of halfway through. So our work in progress goes on. And the rest of the presentation is really to summarize for you what at the moment are the 6 steps that we found that need to be engaged with for the university to take that journey from being part of that problem that I tried to summarize to being part of the solution. I'll start with the first, which is perhaps very obvious, very simple, and fundamental in its implications. Can the university become or return to become a place that questions and exposes what is unseen? And here I will share another postcard, very dear to me, from a documentary on James Baldwin. This is the one quote, if there's anything you want to remember from this talk, it is this quote. James Baldwin is here reflecting on something that has to do with the difficulty of racial discrimination, violence, hatred. He says, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. This quote should be on every door, every wall of the universities today, because there is so much that we do not want to see, that we do not engage with. And that is why the first of the 6 steps is to question and to expose. And I use the word expose, which has been often used in the literature that we've referred to. Now, to do this task, I use, in particular, a set of theoretical frames from another giant from the last century, Donella Meadows, who worked a lot on systems change, and in particular, reflected on what is central here, mindsets. She says system change involves addressing the mindsets out of which the systems arise. The way you think, what you think, your frames of reference. And exposing those mindsets is key to system change. The importance for universities to re-engage with that idea. Another important contribution to our thinking is from Maya Gopal, a German scholar who wrote an incredible book, The Great Mind Shift. This is really about economics, but as I said in my introduction, the problem we are facing is driven by some idea and certain mindsets underlying economic theory. So Maya Gopal draws on Meadows' work, and in particular her theory about leverage points. And she again says, exposing assumptions that are hidden, unexamined, and flawed is essential to any transition, any transformation, any capacity to address the problem. Why? Because these assumptions and the values and the individual choices that are linked to them shape futures. And in the futures literature, there is a lot that can be learned about this. So 3 things need to be questioned and exposed. Assumptions about knowledge. I could run 5 weeks on this. So just 4 bullets for you. Frames of references, our convictions, as Schumacher called them in 1974. Mainly Western, I'm afraid, reductionism, epistemological and ontological, which has become dangerously obsolete and a dying anachronism, but is absolutely out there in our curricula, in what we teach, in what we think. The myths of value-neutral science and core concepts of progress, modernity, and efficiency, to just quote a few, and values and biases that go with them. Other things to question and expose and link to the previous one, of course, is the normative underpinnings of predominant science and political narratives that motivate unsustainability. And they really do motivate unsustainability, which is why it's important to expose them. And organizational issues, the neoliberal agendas behind globalization and rankings of universities and the implications that has, the funding, the time, the degrees. We're still talking about PhDs, we're still talking about free 5-year curricula in 2018 with the technological advances that we have. It's like we live in parallel universe at times. And of course, very dear to intrepid disciplinary power structures. This morning I was having a conversation about this over coffee. Maya says something interesting about this too. She says, the first challenge is to jointly identify which kind of knowledge is important to quickly spread transformative literacy, and the courage and the connections to help unlock the unsustainable path dependencies that keep societies hostage today. So what lies behind the problem that we've looked at, she says, is what the Great Mindship stands for. So knowledge matters, how we think, and what needs to be exposed is fundamental. So step 2 obviously draws on what I already introduced, which is the idea of leverage, which comes from the work of Donella Meadows. What we know and how we think influences beliefs, attitudes, and actions. It shapes who we are, it shapes the experience that we have of the present, and as I already said, it shapes our future. In 1978, a book entitled The Life of the Mind, written by Hannah Arendt, says, I quote, "The activity of knowing is no less related to our sense of reality and no less a world-building activity than the building of houses." Hannah Arendt is a philosopher. So I just want to make that point over and over again, because the whole presentation, the whole agenda about rethinking the future of universities is based on this concern that we almost forget, we only talk about, we only live in our mind, and we know so little about how it works, and we reflect so little about where those thoughts actually come from. Gopal again. Gopal says, sees humans as the loci of change, the ultimate driver of societal change that is located within each one of us. Now, this for us is an important point, because we want to link the fact that we want to question how universities are helping to be the solution. And of course, universities are about shaping minds, which means they're about shaping us, shaping people. And there is the bright side of this, is that what they could do better is to build that human potential, to make us into the best versions of ourselves. Meadows proposes a dozen places to intervene in a system ranked in increasing order of effectiveness. There are 12 points in the leverage point system that she proposes for change. And what we build on is the last three. The last three are the highest leverage point, meaning the ones that are capable of the greatest change. The three highest points are the goals of the system, the mindset or paradigm out of which the system, its goals, structure, rules, delays, and parameters arise, and the power to transcend paradigms. That's the highest level. Meaning that ultimately you need to be able to actually let go and be sufficiently critical, which means you need to have that discussion, that questioning, that exposure, and then that capacity and the humility to let it go, because nothing ultimately will be the right solution. So the ninth leverage point is goals, and here I come to the agenda of the United Nations. Now we know that we've talked about Sustainable Development Goals yesterday. They are a tremendous agenda. They are a tremendously criticized agenda. There's no time here for me to discuss that, but I just want to say two things about that. The first is, I never show the logo of the SDGs because it carries graphical implications and a lot of untold assumptions about how those 17 different topics relate to each other. This is one of many alternative versions that speaks to that criticism, which I think is important to share here. This particular version is based on the idea that the planet needs to function for everything else to follow. So at the root of SDGs are two SDGs, the ones that keep the system going, the planetary system going. Another version that I also share often and that is very dear to me in this discussion is the critique that 17 goals are 17 sub-goals, but there's got to be an ultimate goal. And this is from Costanza and colleague. This is from the discipline of ecological economics. And here we speak about overarching goal. And Costanza and colleagues propose a prosperous, high quality of life that is equitably shared and sustainable. What basically I'm trying to say is that if goals and questioning our goals within universities, and what is the goal of universities, of education, of higher education, in doing that, we need to clarify, to be clear in our minds, to expose what it is that we really think matters, and which is probably the ultimate goal or the overarching goal for us. And to share with you the fact that hopefully this is not entirely theoretical and abstract. This is a couple of slides on a very interesting report from a couple of years ago by the European Environment Agency, which engaged with what we in research arenas talk about as the transition research or transition theory literature. And basically they were looking for solutions to the persistent problems of the sustainability project. And they came up with a very interesting synthesis, which those who deal with sustainability are familiar with, which is this reversal of the idea of the three pillars, social, economic, and environmental, and a building of a stacked system where the environmental, again, just like the tree before, is the base for everything to happen. And crucially, linking to Costanza's argument that you need an overarching goal, they say the overarching goal here is, again, living well within environmental limits. So pretty much the same conclusion, same proposition. And for those of you who are familiar with the Biodiversity Convention and the work of the UN on biodiversity, a similar conclusion has been reached there as well in terms of the overarching goal. The European Environment Agency talks about applying then leverage points again, Meadows' framework, basically, within the idea of how do we transit, how do we transition, and how do we transform our systems to become more sustainable. And they say change must occur in three areas: practices, policies, and thinking. And of course, this is what we're talking about today. It's the thinking part. And I think Mistra will be very happy, Mistra Urban Futures will be very happy to know that the European Environment Agency identifies 4 things about thinking that are important: co-creative processes, experimentation, foresight, and transdisciplinarity. So that was my very quick summary of step 2. Let me move to a very long one, which I'll need to speed up, which is step 3, transforming knowledge. Here I play with the expression that Schumacher used in '74 in critiquing education system, where he says it's all about know-how. Just about that. And he critiqued the lack of wisdom in our system. So I play here with the idea of know-how and how to know. In terms of the third step, it's about transformative knowledge, transformative learning, and transformative pedagogy. There's a lot to be learned and a lot that has been said about this. So I summarize it in 2 broad areas. Competencies is the first. Transformative learning was defined in '91 by Mezirov as affecting change in a frame of reference, habits of mind, points of view, biases and assumptions, and ways of interpreting experience. So the first area, as I said, is competencies. And here I copied the image of the wonderful book that some colleagues from Mistra have produced recently, because it's all really around the notion of reflexivity. UNESCO talks about empowering to question and to change worldviews. And a lot of the discussion around competencies for transformative learning are about altering frames through critical reflection, self-reflection, reflexivity, self-reflexivity, and so on. The language differs, but a lot of the messages go in this direction. Now, of course, the United Nations, which has been promoting education for sustainable development, which is partly what we're talking about here and partly not, has now been supported by a specific goal in the SDG frame, which is SDG 4, which has a target to ensure by 2030 that all learners acquire the knowledge and the skills needed to promote sustainable development. And this has produced an enormous momentum of answers to the question what step 3 should be about: transformative knowledge, learning, and pedagogy, and in particular in terms of competencies. I just list this final list because there is something interesting about it. This is from the UNESCO report in 2017. It lists these competencies as essential: systems thinking, anticipatory, normative, strategic, collaboration, critical thinking, integrated problem solving. And then it adds self-awareness. And I'll say just a couple of things about the last one. It was not there for a long time in this kind of literature, and it was added to say this: the ability to reflect on one's own role in the local community and global society, to continually evaluate and further motivate one's actions, and to deal with one's feelings and desires. And this, I think, echoes somewhat with the work that Mistra Urban Futures does in co-production, and with what we do with Struggle mainly, in the attempt to do inter- and transdisciplinarity within Intrepid. And in Intrepid, as we engage with some of these questions, what came out in our workshops in particular, where we had some fantastic facilitators, was that to unlock the human potential, as we like to call it, the ultimate driver of social change, as Gopal refers to it, we discovered again that we have a body and that it matters. And this is important in academia because we tend to be that brain on sticks kind of vision. And this is funny and tragic because we know in many different ways. We have 6 senses and it's for a reason. So we would like to engage, and the literature on self-awareness which is the expression used for competencies in UNESCO, is vast in academia. And I'll just summarize it briefly, but basically it does point to the need to re-embody ourselves, even when we go through those beautiful doors of academic institutions. This is, for example, a report produced in last year by the Global Education Futures Network, which talks about the need for competencies in intrapersonal and interpersonal capacities. Fidel talks about personal growth, and a lot of other people talk about emotional maturity for responsible decision making and the affective domain, all aspects and competencies that require us to re-engage with who we are, but also with how we feel, our way, how we interpret reality through our bodies as well as our minds. So another part of competencies is, of course, how we learn, and this again goes back to the key word of reflexiveness and reflexive awareness. And an emphasis is made on the legitimacy of multiple science and non-science perspectives on sustainability, about the limits to present conceptions of reliable knowing, and of the idea that man is only a part of a larger system and that the part can never control the whole. All these, we all know them, but they build into the rethinking about the future of universities, and you see where the pieces, where the gaps are, where the problems lie, often unseen or just forgotten. Fidel talks about metacognition, and Bateson beautifully talks about diversity in the need to integrate other sources from different cultural backgrounds and traditions to overcome, again, Western reductionism and dualistic views, and to move towards integral interdependence of culture, biology, and ecology. Again, I know that in Mistra you've been engaging with this day in and day out. So what I'm pointing at effectively is that I think you're an important piece of my puzzle for futures of universities, but I'll conclude on that later. Content, bucket loads of publications about what content is needed for transformative learning, knowledge, and pedagogy. But there is one particular issue I want to raise here, which links with goals, the 9th leverage point that Donella talks about. Because content, we love the concept of neutrality in academia, but it's just an idea. So again, we need to expose what it is that lies behind the content that we present. And a lot of work is going into, reconnecting with explicit goals. So if we do think that academia needs to be part of the solution and needs to promote sustainability, perhaps we should stand up and say that. And I can assure you there are a lot of corridors I know where you don't do that. And if you do that, it's like you're being normative, which is considered pretty much a fundamental lethal flaw, or you're just, sustainability is just a topic. It might be your topic, but it ain't mine. And this I have witnessed in many parts of the globe. So in summary, I'm summarizing the whole agenda of content of transformative learning with this image. I've come to love spiders. Connectedness, interdependency, interconnectedness, the whole agenda is littered with this. Bateson works is fundamental for this, but I'll leave you with this image. Remember, it has a tremendous contribution for us. And last, in the transformative agenda, and a very important aspect is the issue of what matters ultimately. It's linked to what I just said about goals. But basically, the transformative learning needs goals and it needs direction. And as Jacob notes in that quote I shared with you, our mental and ethical capacities do not keep up with our outer technological driven changes. This is a very big problem. We are always a little bit behind. And we are behind of something that is bigger and bigger and bigger. So what is academia doing about this? And in this, I think we are very much part of the problem. And we need to really step up to become part of the solution. In the whole science policy agenda, this is discussed as research, I've now forgotten the expression that the European Union uses, responsible research. But again, let me go to a couple of postcards and back to Mbembe. He has a fantastic reflection on this. He says, the denigration of virtues such as care, compassion, and kindness will go hand in hand with the belief that winning is all that matters, and who wins, by whatever means necessary, is ultimately right. So, should be of concern to education as well. And Schumacher, again, has very clear ideas about this. He says the essence of education is the transmission of values that must become the very instruments through which we look at, interpret, and experience the world. What do we get from education today, he asks. A view of the world as a wasteland in which there is no meaning or purpose, in which man's consciousness is an unfortunate cosmic accident, in which anguish and despair are the final realities. Sometimes I wonder whether he wrote it yesterday or he wrote it in 1974. The point here about ethics, about values, about reflecting on them, and about engaging with the question of what really matters has also a vast literature. But I want to close this on with a quote from a book on moral clarity by Neiman, where she says that Western secular culture has no clear place for moral language, and its use makes many profoundly uncomfortable. And this is a big problem in academia. So in summary, know how, yes, but how to know and what matters are the three components of the transformative agenda. And somehow I need to speed into my last three steps. Whole system change. I will not show you, I'll run through these slides. What I want to say about whole systems change is that UNESCO's agenda for education and sustainable development promoted a decade in its perhaps somewhat desperate attempt to raise again the topic of education for sustainable development, which started in 1992. And over a decade, it worked very hard to promote that agenda. And one of the things that they came up with was, it's not about content. It's not about adding that sustainable development course. It's about whole system change. Now, unfortunately, their idea of whole system change falls short of what scholars have been discussing in higher education. This is their agenda, but what matters is that their summary of that agenda is this: it hasn't occurred yet, and they wrote this in 2014. And that, together with the fact that it falls short of what is actually needed, which is not just curricular and pedagogic changes, but overall governance and management practice that are the foundation of regimes and transition theory. And those of us in academia who work in the system know exactly what that means. In Intrepid, most of our work about the obstacles to inter- and transdisciplinarity fall into this category, and it's like we haven't even started. There are fantastic cases, but they are, in transition theory, called niches, and they are yet to change the regime, as they call it. So, almost there. Sorry, that was very long. I remember someone yesterday, I think it was Catherine, no, it was Caroline. You said half an hour is all that people can take. Just fine. Just put that additional stress. Okay. So the last two steps. And remember, this is work in progress, so no, there's still three, sorry, this is the third. Role and function, very quickly, because you all know the answers. The question is, in an age of Anthropocene, what are universities good at, and what are they for? As you can see, I'm always going around the same issue, but with different language. Because the problem is simple, it really is. The solution will take a little bit of elaboration. So we came up with this summary of all the ideas out there, that universities need to engage with two dimensions and two roles and functions. One is the community of thinking, which they're somewhat good at, but with all those problems that I've tried to list. And the other is not a new idea that goes under the label civic university, but which is dear to, I think, very much the efforts of both Mistra and Intrepid. In terms of community of thinking, it's about community of thinking in a broad sense and not merely in terms of research or community of reason. To assume that universities have a fundamental role in fighting conformism in the public debate, becoming places where education may be considered a practice of freedom, by which, and I quote Scholl, we mean the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. The second, civic university, builds on a long tradition. And in the UK in particular, there are some tremendous scholars that have written about this over decades, last century. Civic university, because of its responsibility to act as a space for participatory processes that can socialize envisioning practices and thus help to operationalize transition. Yesterday we were talking about the importance of envisioning futures linked to Sustainable Development Goals. There are some very hopeful scholars who've written extensively about the aptitude of universities to be spaces for this. I beg to differ in the sense that I think, yes, we have that potential. Sometimes we use it, often we do not. But that is what I think one of the core major contributions of this initiative that you're all involved in has to show and to offer again and again to explain how you can do that. How can you make all these wonderful ideas and these wonderful quotes that I've shared with you actually in practice work in academia today and crucially tomorrow. So I'm almost done. So let's think civic and unite those two roles and functions. And perhaps this is a copy from another proposition of what universities were about, which was more traditional, and I've sort of warped it and co-opted it and changed it. So the first mission, our traditional mission, has something to do with education, and the proposition here might be that education should be relevant to build human potential and make it explicit and make it really the aim and the objective of every day's work. That education is about academia, yes, but not only academia, not only that source of knowledge. Second mission, generation of sustainability-driven knowledge and capabilities. If we are to be part of the solution, let's be clear about that. Sustainability is not a quaint topic amongst many, and if it is, we do have a problem, and we will be part of that problem. Third mission, translation of knowledge, not so much in innovation, please, not only. That was what was before. But in deep understanding and vision and action, which again is what you guys at Mistra try to build every day. So finally, the last step, a place to envision. The competencies we listed under transformative learning include anticipatory competencies. It's very interesting. Future studies, a discipline which is not a discipline is trying to become a discipline, interestingly, from my perspective, and I'm fighting the whole notion, or at least questioning the legitimacy of disciplines in today's era, and asking for a bit more humility. We do need disciplines, we need depth, but we do need humility within those disciplines to allow for those connections, to allow to know that if you have been trained in, I was trained in geography, which is not such a good example, but anyway, if you have trained in geography, which is a very porous discipline, yes, it's great, but economics also matters, etc. So you get the gist. Can universities be a place to envision desired futures? I think it matters because in the work we've done, and the work as a scholar that I do, one of the greatest failures, and again I can quote Donella Meadows because she said it beautifully in '94 at a conference, it's not about the means, which includes knowledge, it's about whether you know where you want to go. And the truth is that when you really think about it, do we know what we mean in our hearts and minds when we want a sustainable future? And unless we have a somewhat clear idea of what we're aiming for, it's going to be very hard to get there. No amount of knowledge, tools, techniques, technology, etc., will help you or help us. So I think, and I think dearly, that universities should also embrace actively and become that space for envisioning, or to use a wonderful expression that Levitas uses, to educate desire. Where there is no vision, the people perish. A utopian ethic for a transformed future is necessary. She was writing this specifically reflecting on sustainable futures. So finally, quote from UNESCO, an earlier report that they produced in '98. They say, ultimately, higher education should aim at the creation of a new society, non-violent and non-exploitative. Basically, a good other way, two other words to express those two postcards that I showed you at the beginning of what the problem is. Consisting of highly cultivated, motivated, and integrated individuals inspired by love for humanity and guided by wisdom. Can we therefore reimagine ourselves? I think we can. I want to believe that we can, and I think we must. And I think it would be nice for us to do some work in envisioning how we can do that, and what is it that really matters to us, and how we can contribute to that change. In the journey, I call it a journey because it really is a journey, rather than an inquiry only. We suggest that there is much to be optimistic about what is out there. There are inspiring initiatives. There are many niches in transition speak, departments, universities, entire universities that really change. But the problem is what we've said at the beginning, and that problem is fast forwarding. There is something important here to be reflected upon in terms of our technological prowess, as I referred to at the beginning, which, by the way, has fascinating and fundamental implications for what is it going to be like to teach in 5 years from now, not 20. Is any of us, at least our bodies, going to be entitled to a job in academia when, technology is going to do such a great job at it? Possibly, the answer is we desperately need each and everybody to be there, in their body, in their flesh, somewhere, in some place, because it will matter. But we need to clarify in our mind why that will make a difference. And it has to do with all the questions that I've shared with you. There are, therefore, many inspiring initiatives out there. And I really want to say Mistra Urban Futures' contribution is a shining example in this, because they are struggling with some very fundamental aspects of what is not working in our production of knowledge, but what could work so much better, and the difference it will make. But we cannot be complacent, because the core drivers that make us a part of the problem are strong, they are resilient, they are internally robust, and, as I said, fast forwarding. When we look in Intrepid at our focus, which is interdisciplinarity and disciplinary boundaries and the obstacles to it, it is hard sometimes to be positive, thinking, God, really? Still so difficult? But we have part of the answers, I think. I've tried to organize them in these 6 steps. I'll probably talk about 4, hopefully, very soon. But they are crucial steps or crucial elements of this journey. And setting clear goals and the SDGs, fine, they are great if we are reflexive about them. They can help, but there is always going to be the need for an ultimate goal. And everyone, I think, has the responsibility to answer that question, what is the ultimate goal? Because these are only intermediate goals, no matter how they are presented. And for the university, my suggestion from this journey within Intrepid has been really to point to the human potential and to what universities can do about that, but to focus on the human potential, which goes back to postcard number 3 from Gary Jacobs, from that novel about artificial intelligence. Yes, we can be empowered by technology, but there is something so fantastic about being a human being, and it needs to be at the center of our attention. It's really a whole world that still needs to be untapped, I think, in terms of who we are and what we can be and how we can contribute to be that solution. So, thank you very much for that long attention.